Every single morning, before you've even had your first sip of coffee, your arteries are already reacting to what's coming. Not tomorrow, not next year. Within about 2 to 4 hours of that breakfast plate, your blood vessels are measurably different than they were before you ate. That's not a theory. That's something doctors can actually watch happen in real time with an ultrasound wand pressed against your arm. I want you to sit with that for a second. The stiffening, the inflammation, the slow accumulation of plaque that eventually shows up as a heart attack or a stroke. A lot of people picture that as something that happens quietly over decades, invisible, unconnected to any single meal. And in one sense, that's true. But in another sense, every breakfast is a small vote. And some of the most popular breakfast foods and habits in the Western world are casting that vote against you, every single day, without you ever feeling a thing. I'm Dr. Park. I've spent more than 15 years in internal medicine and nutritional biochemistry, which is really just the science of what food actually does to your body once it's inside you, down at the level of your cells and your blood vessels. Cardiovascular disease is the thing I think about more than almost anything else, because it's the leading cause of death for people over 50 in most of the Western world, and because, unlike a lot of conditions, so much of it is genuinely preventable if you know what you're dealing with. Today I want to walk you through 5 breakfast foods, or breakfast habits, that are quietly working against your arteries. And I want to tell you right now, stay with me, because the last one on this list is the one that surprises almost everyone. It's the one that health-conscious people who are already trying to do everything right, tend to add to their mornings specifically because they believe it's good for them. And that belief is exactly the problem. I'm not here to sell you a supplement, and I'm not here to scare you into some 6-week program. I'm here to give you the research, explained in plain language, and let you make an informed decision at your own kitchen table. Before we get into the list, I want to give you one idea to carry through the whole video, because every single item we talk about today connects back to it. It's a term called endothelial function. And once you understand it, breakfast will never look quite the same to you again. The endothelium is the thin, delicate lining on the inside of every blood vessel in your body. Arteries, veins, capillaries, all of it. Picture the inside of a garden hose, except instead of rubber, it's a living layer of cells, only one cell thick, that's constantly sensing what's flowing past it and adjusting. A healthy endothelium releases a molecule called nitric oxide, which tells the blood vessel to relax and widen slightly, so blood flows smoothly and pressure stays where it should. That lining is also your first line of defense against the whole process of atherosclerosis, the slow buildup of fatty plaque that eventually narrows arteries and can rupture, which is what actually triggers most heart attacks and many strokes. Here's the part that matters for today's topic. That lining doesn't just get damaged over years. It responds within hours, meal to meal. A high sugar, high saturated fat, high sodium meal can measurably impair how well that lining relaxes and functions for several hours afterward. Do that once, your arteries recover. Do that most mornings for 20 years, and you've built the foundation of a lot of the cardiovascular disease we see in clinic. So keep that phrase in your head, endothelial function, because you're going to hear it again in the next few minutes, and I want you to understand it's not an abstract lab term. It's about how well your blood is actually moving through your body, starting the moment you swallow that first bite. Let's start the list. Number 5 is the coffee creamer sitting on your counter right now. Specifically, the powdered or liquid non-dairy creamers that so many people pour into their coffee without ever reading the label. Because it's just coffee, right? It's not really a meal. Here's why a splash of creamer earns a spot on a list about your arteries. Years ago, most of these products were built on partially hydrogenated oil, which is the industrial source of artificial trans fat. The single worst fat for your cardiovascular system that we've ever identified, worse per gram than butter or lard. The good news is that the FDA formally restricted partially hydrogenated oils from the US food supply back in 2018, and that change alone is estimated to have prevented a meaningful number of heart attacks nationally. So if you're wondering whether creamer is exactly the villain it used to be, it genuinely isn't, and I want to give credit where it's due. But here's what a lot of people don't realize took its place. Many of these same creamers replace the trans fat with heavily refined vegetable oils, added sugar, and a concentrated dose of saturated fat, often disguised behind words like coconut cream or creamer base. A couple of tablespoons doesn't sound like much. But if you're doing that 2 or 3 times a day, every day, for years, you're adding a steady trickle of saturated fat and sugar directly into your bloodstream on an empty stomach. Which, remember, is exactly the kind of exposure that leans on that endothelial lining we just talked about. So what should you do? Read the ingredient label once, just once, and see how many ingredients you don't recognize. If it's a long list of oils and gums and sugar, consider switching to real milk, unsweetened plant milk, or a small amount of half and half. It sounds almost too simple, but a splash of the real thing, in a smaller amount, is usually gentler on your arteries than a larger splash of the engineered version. This isn't about fear. It's about what your arteries feel in the hours after breakfast, and that's a phrase I want you to remember, because we're going to come back to it. Number 4 is processed breakfast meat. Bacon, breakfast sausage, sausage links, the whole category. And I know, for a lot of you, this is close to sacred. I'm not asking you to swear off it forever. I'm asking you to understand exactly what it's doing. 2 things happen when you eat processed breakfast meat regularly. First is sodium. 2 strips of bacon can carry somewhere around 300 to 400 milligrams of sodium, and a couple of sausage links can add another few hundred on top of that, and that's before you've added anything else to the plate. The American Heart Association's ideal daily sodium target is around 1,500 milligrams for most adults, especially those managing blood pressure, and the general upper limit most guidelines use is 2,300. So one processed breakfast can already use up a third to half of your entire day's sodium budget. Sodium doesn't just make you retain a little water, it directly raises blood pressure in a large portion of the population, particularly as we get older and our kidneys become less efficient at clearing excess sodium. And elevated blood pressure is, quite simply, one of the most direct mechanical stresses on that arterial lining we've been discussing. It's like running a garden hose at a higher pressure than the hose was built for, day after day. Second is the curing process itself. Processed meats are preserved using sodium nitrite, which under high heat, like a hot skillet, can form compounds called nitrosamines. This is the same chemistry behind why the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies processed meat as a Group 1 carcinogen, meaning there's sufficient evidence linking it to human cancer, specifically colorectal cancer. I want to be precise about that classification because it's about cancer risk with regular, frequent consumption, not a death sentence over one bacon breakfast. For today's topic, what matters most is the sodium and the saturated fat working together, meal after meal, on your blood pressure and your vessel lining. So what should you do? You don't have to eliminate it. Treat it the way you'd treat dessert. A smaller portion, less often, maybe once a week instead of daily. And when you do have it, look for nitrate-free or lower sodium versions. Or better yet, swap in a couple of eggs, some smoked salmon, or a small portion of Canadian bacon, which runs meaningfully lower in sodium and saturated fat than traditional bacon or sausage. Number 3 is fruit juice, and I mean any fruit juice, including the 100% juice, no sugar added bottle that looks like the responsible choice sitting right next to the soda in the store. Here's why juice belongs on this list, and it surprises people every time, because juice has spent decades marketed as a health food. The problem isn't that juice is fake or artificial, it's that it's real fruit sugar with almost none of the fiber that would normally slow it down. An orange has fiber that makes your body absorb its natural sugar gradually. Squeeze that same orange into juice, and you've stripped out the fiber and concentrated the sugar. A single 8-ounce glass of orange juice can carry roughly 20 to 26 grams of sugar, which is genuinely comparable to a can of soda. Here's the mechanism that matters for your arteries specifically. That sugar, mostly fructose, goes straight to your liver, where in large or frequent quantities, it gets converted into triglycerides, a type of fat that circulates in your blood. Elevated triglycerides, especially the after-meal spike known as postprandial lipemia, have been linked in research to greater oxidative stress on the vessel wall, and, over time, to a higher risk of cardiovascular events. This is well documented in nutrition science. Regular high intake of sugar-sweetened beverages and juice counts here is associated with higher rates of heart disease in large population studies tracking tens of thousands of people over many years. I want to be precise with that language, associated with, in long-term studies. This is the kind of evidence that builds a strong case over time, not a single controlled experiment proving direct causation in every individual. But the consistency of the finding across multiple independent research groups is part of why most cardiologists take it seriously. So what should you do? Eat the orange instead of drinking it. If you love juice, treat it like a treat. A small glass occasionally, not a daily habit, and pair it with protein or fiber if you do have it, which blunts the sugar spike. Sparkling water with a splash of real juice for flavor is a swap a lot of my patients have genuinely come to prefer once they get used to it. Now, before we get to the top 2, I want you to lean in a little, because numbers 2 and 1 are the ones that trip up even the people who think they're already eating healthy. Number 2 is the sugary, refined carbohydrate breakfast. The bagel with cream cheese, the muffin, the sweetened cereal, the toaster pastry. This is the one that looks completely ordinary, completely harmless, and completely unremarkable. That's exactly why it does so much quiet damage. Here's the mechanism, and this is where that word from earlier comes back. Endothelial function. When you eat a meal that's mostly refined flour and added sugar, with very little fiber, fat, or protein to slow digestion, your blood glucose spikes quickly. That spike triggers a surge of insulin to bring it back down. Researchers who study this directly, using ultrasound to measure how well an artery dilates or relaxes in response to increased blood flow, have found that a high glycemic, high sugar meal can temporarily blunt that dilation response for a few hours afterward. In plain terms, your blood vessels become measurably less flexible and less responsive right after that kind of breakfast. It's temporary in any single instance, but if that's your breakfast most mornings for years, you're asking your arteries to spend several hours a day in a less functional state, over and over, which is exactly the repeated stress that contributes to long-term arterial stiffening and plaque formation. There's a second layer here too. Repeated glucose and insulin spikes, over years, are part of what drives insulin resistance, a state where your cells stop responding efficiently to insulin, which is closely tied to prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. And diabetes, independent of everything else we've talked about today, roughly doubles a person's risk of cardiovascular disease. That's not a scare tactic. That's one of the most well-established relationships in all of internal medicine. So what should you do? You don't have to give up bread or cereal forever. The fix is usually simpler than people expect. Add protein and fiber to the same meal. A boiled egg alongside that bagel. Nuts or Greek yogurt with that cereal. Whole grain instead of white flour where you can. The goal isn't perfection. It's blunting the spike, not eliminating carbohydrates from your life. And now, the one I promised you. Number 1, the one that surprises health-conscious people most, because so many of you are doing this on purpose, believing it's protecting you. I'm talking about adding a spoonful of butter, ghee, or coconut oil to your morning coffee. The bulletproof coffee trend that took off promising mental clarity, steady energy, and fat burning. Here's why this one earns the top spot. The people doing this tend to be exactly the audience of this channel. Engaged, proactive, already cutting sugar, already skeptical of processed food. And that's precisely what makes it dangerous. It slips past your defenses because it's dressed up as the healthy choice. Let's talk about what's actually happening. Coconut oil is roughly 80 to 90% saturated fat, which is a higher concentration than butter itself. Multiple controlled studies, including a Cochrane review, one of the most rigorous forms of evidence synthesis in medicine, and a formal scientific advisory from the American Heart Association, have found that coconut oil raises LDL cholesterol, the particle most directly implicated in building arterial plaque, to a similar degree as other saturated fats like butter or beef fat. That's despite years of popular claims that coconut oil is somehow the good saturated fat. The evidence on that particular claim simply hasn't held up the way the marketing suggested. Now, one large spoonful of fat in your coffee isn't going to give you a heart attack tomorrow. I want to be honest about the actual magnitude here, not the panic version. But if you're doing this daily, you're adding somewhere around 12 to 14 grams of saturated fat to your first meal of the day, every day, on top of whatever saturated fat is already in your regular diet. And most people are already at or near the recommended daily limit for saturated fat before that coffee ever touches their lips. The American Heart Association generally recommends keeping saturated fat under about 6% of total daily calories for someone managing cardiovascular risk, which for most adults works out to roughly 11 to 13 grams a day. One cup of that coffee can use up your entire daily allowance before you've eaten breakfast. And here's the layer that makes this genuinely the most surprising item on the list. LDL cholesterol doesn't cause symptoms while it's rising. There's no ache, no warning sign. It builds silently in your bloodstream and in your arterial walls for years, showing up only when there's already meaningful plaque, sometimes as the very first heart attack. That's why this particular habit worries me more than an occasional plate of bacon, because the person doing it feels like they're winning, feels sharper, feels lighter, and has no internal signal telling them their LDL is climbing. So what should you do? If you enjoy the ritual of coffee with a little richness, you don't need to abandon it, but treat the fat like a garnish, not a meal component. A teaspoon rather than a heaping tablespoon. And if energy and focus are what you're actually chasing, protein at breakfast tends to deliver steadier, longer-lasting energy than a spoonful of saturated fat ever will, without the LDL cost. I want to pause here and bring in something from my own training and background, because I think it genuinely illuminates the whole list we just went through, rather than just decorating it. In Korea, there's a phrase, yaksik dongwon. It roughly translates to, food and medicine share the same root. It's an old idea, but the modern research on Korean longevity actually backs a version of it up. A traditional Korean breakfast, rice, a light soup, a few vegetable side dishes, some fermented vegetables, tends to be lower in saturated fat and added sugar than a typical Western breakfast plate. And some population studies out of Korea have pointed to that traditional dietary pattern as one contributing factor, among several in the country's historically strong cardiovascular longevity numbers. But I want to be completely honest with you, because I promised you the real research, not a flattering story about my own culture. That same traditional Korean diet has historically run quite high in sodium. Korea has had some of the highest average sodium intake levels in the world, largely from fermented and salted foods, and Korean public health researchers have spent decades specifically trying to bring that number down, because it's been linked to elevated stroke rates in the population. So no, Korean is not a magic word for heart safe. A bowl of doenjang jjigae, a fermented soybean stew, can carry as much sodium as 2 strips of bacon, sometimes more. The lesson isn't eat Korean food. The lesson is the same one under everything we've covered today. Look past the label, the marketing, the culture, and ask what's actually happening once it crosses that arterial lining. Let me tell you about a patient. I'll call David, because his story ties this whole list together better than any statistic could. David was 63, an engineer, recently retired, and about as health conscious as they come. He'd cut out soda years earlier, he walked every morning, and about a year before I saw him, he'd started bulletproof coffee because a podcast convinced him it would sharpen his focus and help him lose the last few pounds around his middle. He also, like a lot of my patients, had bacon a few mornings a week and orange juice most days, because that's just what breakfast had always looked like for him. When his labs came back, his LDL cholesterol had climbed noticeably from the year before, and he was genuinely stunned because he felt like he was doing everything right. We didn't overhaul his whole life. We made 3 specific changes. He swapped the spoonful of coconut oil for a teaspoon, swapped the daily orange juice for the actual orange a couple of mornings a week, and cut bacon down to once a week instead of 4 times. 6 months later, his LDL had come down meaningfully, without a single new medication. What struck me most wasn't the number. It was what he said in that follow-up visit. He told me it felt like he'd been given something to add to his mornings. A little more attention, a little more awareness, rather than one more thing taken away from him. That's the shift I want for you too. Now, I want to be honest with you about where general advice like this has limits, because that's part of respecting you as an intelligent adult, rather than handing you a one-size-fits-all script. If you're already managing high blood pressure, kidney disease, or you're on dialysis, sodium limits that apply to a general audience may be significantly stricter for you specifically, and that's a conversation to have directly with your nephrologist or your care team, not a video. If you're on a blood thinner like warfarin, changes to how much leafy green vegetable or fermented food you eat can actually interact with your medication through vitamin K, so any real dietary shift is worth mentioning to whoever manages that prescription. If you have familial hypercholesterolemia or a strong family history of early heart disease, your LDL targets are likely lower than the general population's, and saturated fat sources like the coconut oil we talked about deserve even more caution in your specific case. And if you take a statin or any cholesterol medication, please don't hear anything in this video as permission to stop taking it, because you've made some dietary swaps. Food is a powerful lever, but it works alongside your prescribed treatment, not as a replacement for it. If there's one lab number I'd ask you to request at your next appointment, especially if you're over 50, it's a full lipid panel that includes LDL, HDL, and triglycerides. Plus, if your doctor agrees it's appropriate, something called HSCRP, a marker of inflammation that many cardiologists now use alongside cholesterol to get a fuller picture of arterial risk. You can't make good decisions for your arteries without knowing your actual numbers, and too many people over 50 are guessing. And I want to say clearly, everything in this video is educational information based on published research, not personalized medical advice. I don't know your specific health history, your medications, or your labs. Please talk to your own physician or a registered dietitian before making any significant change to your diet, especially if you're managing an existing heart or kidney condition, if you're on blood thinners, or if you're on dialysis. This video is meant to inform that conversation, not replace it. So let's bring this all the way back together. 5 things quietly working against your arteries at breakfast. Flavored, engineered coffee creamer with its hidden saturated fat and sugar, best swapped for a smaller amount of the real thing. Processed breakfast meats like bacon and sausage, whose sodium and nitrosamine-forming curing process stress both blood pressure and vessel lining, best treated as an occasional food rather than a daily one. Fruit juice, which strips out the fiber that would normally slow down fruit sugar, best replaced by the actual fruit most mornings. Sugary, refined carbohydrate breakfasts, which spike blood sugar and insulin, and measurably blunt how well your arteries relax for hours afterward. Best paired with protein and fiber, rather than eaten alone. And the one that surprised the most people watching, a spoonful of butter or coconut oil in your coffee, which quietly delivers a full day's worth of saturated fat before you've even eaten breakfast. Best treated as a small garnish, rather than a daily ritual. If you only change one thing tonight, make it this. Look at whatever you add to your coffee tomorrow morning, and ask yourself honestly whether it earned its place there through evidence or through marketing. That single question will do more for your arteries over the next 10 years than almost anything else on this list. Your arteries don't take a day off for breakfast. They respond to what you eat within hours, whether you feel it or not. And they're listening tomorrow morning whether you remember this video or not. That's not meant to frighten you. It's meant to hand you back a little control, because once you know what's actually happening inside that thin lining of your blood vessels, you get to decide what goes past it. I'd love to know which one of these 5 surprised you the most. Tell me in the comments, and if you've already made one of these swaps in your own life, share what it was, because someone reading the comments tomorrow morning might need to hear it from you rather than from me. If you found this useful, consider subscribing. This channel exists to bring you real, sourced information about aging well and staying strong after 60, without the fear-mongering and without the sales pitch. And if this video helped you, there's a good chance someone in your life is doing one of these 5 things without ever having thought twice about it. It takes 10 seconds to send this to them. Next week, I want to take you through 5 everyday drinks that are quietly raising your blood pressure, and at least 2 of them are sitting in refrigerators across the country, labeled as the healthy option. I'll see you then.